Welcome everyone. Now, obviously, the USSR played a major role in the post-war world, but I want to discuss the problems and trace the fall of the USSR and the Eastern Bloc. In this video, I'm just going to focus on the tensions and the problems in the USSR. There'll be a second video that talks about the actual collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, the easiest way I can think to explain the fall of the Soviet Union is to focus on the issue of money. This is the big problem. The USSR needs to spend money in three major areas. One is its military. It needs both a large conventional military and it needs to be investing in things like nuclear weapons in order to compete with the United States. We're in the middle of the Cold War. Second, it needs money for foreign policy issues. As we are in the 60s, 70s, decolonization means that there are lots of new countries around the world, and the US and the USSR are competing for them. Because definitely, on the whole, the US and the USSR do not think you can be allied with both of them. So if you have a new country in, let's say, Africa that's becoming independent, the US and the USSR will be sending significant aid and other help, potentially even military help, in order to assist that state, with the hope that that new country will ally with one or the other. So for the USSR, they need to spend significant money to counter US foreign policy money. And third, they have got to get their domestic economy functioning better. There has been very little money for investment in the domestic economy, and so things are running into trouble. Basically, the Soviet Union can do 2 out of the 3, but does not have the money to do all 3, and that is going to create the problems. So let's talk a little bit about Brezhnev. He's in power from the mid-60s to the early 80s. Quite along this whole period, basically, is the period of Brezhnev. So he's leading the Soviet Union. He's the Communist Party secretary. So let's talk about his foreign policy issues. If he's going to be successful, if Russia's going to be successful in foreign policy, then what is he facing? Well, first of all, one of his major problems is China. Now, China is communist, that is true, but it does not like the USSR. The problem here is that the USSR saw itself as the nation that would lead the world into communism. Remember, all the way back to Stalin, that was its role. But for China, China wants to play that role as the most important communist nation. And so it just says, look, I mean, Russia's been trying to do this for decades and they've totally failed. And so China is the one who should lead the world into the communist light. And so actually you have the USSR competing not only with the US for allies and for control of different nations, but you also have China and the USSR competing. So that is not helping anything. As I mentioned, we do have the US and the USSR competing in Asia, in Africa, and even in Europe for alliance partners for where they're going to get support. And so that is a major problem too. And also in Eastern Europe in the late 1960s, there are some uprisings. There's an especially important one that happens in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So in 1968, Czechoslovakia starts to move away from communism. And the Warsaw Pact, remember that's the alliance that the Soviets have in Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact with the USSR invades into Czechoslovakia to keep it communist, which is really what the Warsaw Pact is supposed to do. But that's expensive and it's unpopular. And really, if you're trying to say that communism is the best system, the fact that you have to invade to force a country to remain communist is not really going to read well on the brochure. So this is a major problem as well. And they're having to increase the number of troops that they keep in Eastern Europe. The next major kind of major foreign policy problem is going to be in Afghanistan. So in 1978, so we're like 10 years after the Prague Spring, in 1978, The Marxist Party in Afghanistan overthrows the government. So they overthrow the monarchy, but they are very unstable. They thought they had more support than they did. So they're holding the control of the government, but just barely. And so they call on the USSR to assist them. And the USSR has said that they'll come into countries to help protect communism, just like the US has said we'll come into any country to protect capitalism. So what happens then in 1979 is the Marxist government appeals to the USSR for aid, and then the USSR decides to send troops into Afghanistan. And the idea here is this is going to be a quick little war. And as you probably know from this class, most of the time when you think it's going to be a quick little war, it's not a quick little war. So one of the problems in Afghanistan is both the US and China send money and military support to the people who are fighting Russia. So in Afghanistan, you have groups that are receiving Chinese assistance, groups that are receiving US assistance, and then the groups that are working with the Soviet Union. Those groups, the US and China support is a major problem for Russia. So basically, it gets involved in an 8-year war that's very expensive and very unpopular at home. And in fact, oftentimes this war is going to be called the Russian Vietnam, because eventually Russia just has to give up and pull out. So they get nothing out of this. So you have one of the world's superpowers who is being defeated by Afghanistan, who is definitely not a world superpower. Now, let me just say, historically, controlling Afghanistan is very difficult. No imperial power has been able to do that. It just doesn't tend to happen. And we, of course, in the United States have had our own issues in Afghanistan. But for now, for the Soviet Union, which is our focus in this video, this means that the Soviet Union loses a big war. They gain nothing from it except embarrassment because they aren't able to win. And there's a lot of kind of anti-war feeling at home in the Soviet Union itself. Now, on the domestic front, the economy is in trouble. Basically, the main problem is because so much money is being spent on the military and on foreign policy, that the Soviet Union is not modernizing its industry. So a lot of the factories are getting way out of date, and that means that what they produce is very expensive, or it actually doesn't even work. So one of the problems here is that the Soviet Union has had a series of 5-year plans, and these are goals to how much economic growth they want to see in 5 years. And so the factories and farms are told how much they have to produce. But no one actually says that it has to actually work. And so the idea here is you just work to what you're supposed to produce. So if we produce light bulbs, let's say we all work in a light bulb factory, and we're supposed to produce 5,000 light bulbs a day, well, we just kind of fake the numbers. Or maybe we produce light bulbs that don't even work, but we count them towards the count. So that is going to mean that in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc, you have a lot of goods that are very expensive and they don't tend to work, which doesn't make people happy. And so in the Soviet Union, by the time we hit the late 70s, economic growth is zero. And you just don't want to see economic growth at zero, especially if you're trying to institute the communist revolution. You're trying to have Russia be the shining light of communism so that people decide they want to become communist. And this is not good. And you also have people at home who are really frustrated. There basically had been what we historians usually call kind of an unspoken agreement, that in the Soviet Union, every generation would see higher standards of living. And in return, they would basically not protest against the government. And really, why would you protest against the government if your life is getting better all the time? But the big question by the late 70s is what happens when that unspoken agreement is broken? The Soviet people don't have rights, and their standards of living are collapsing. And that's not the kind of unspoken deal that has been there. People have thought they should just show up to work and get their bonuses. Their kids should have better apartments than they have, that kind of thing. And it's not happening. And so that means it may be time for the Soviet people to begin protesting against the government, to demand better lives, higher living standards, to actually finally fulfill that promise of living in a communist utopia. And that is certainly not what Russia looks like in 1979.